Funding for New Mexico in Focus provided by the McCune Charitable Foundation. And viewers like you.
This week on New Mexico in Focus, at long last, Virgin Galactic is weightless. Now what?
To the next generation of dreamers, if we can do this, just imagine what you can do.
Plus, the gravity of the education crisis on the Navajo Nation as the pandemic recedes. New Mexico in Focus starts now. Thanks for joining us this week. I'm your host, Gene Grant. Just how hard has it been for some students to learn during the pandemic? The answer, which involves driving a truck to the top of a hill where there's cell service, is almost unbelievable. Senior producer Matt Grubbs chats with a journalist who's been covering it. Now, the Republican primary for governor is a year away, and the race just got a charge this month from the official and widely expected entry of State Representative Rebecca Dow. The Line Opinion panel will look at the campaign and the issues we expect candidates to be talking about at this time next year. We begin with news that's been a decade and a half in the making. Here's the line. Finally, right? After years of missed deadlines, Virgin Galactic made good on Richard Branson's promise to send people into space from New Mexico desert a half dozen at a time, with what the company called a fully crewed flight on July 11th. Mark that date in infamy. Now, we care, of course, because taxpayers have shelled out hundreds of millions of dollars on the venture. So here to talk through when or if New Mexico can expect a payoff is our Line Opinion panel. Attorney and longtime Line regular Laura Sanchez is back. Editor and publisher of the Santa Fe Reporter, our friend Julianne Grimm, returns this week, as does another Line regular, Tom Garrity. Since you're the marketing guy, Tom, let me start with you. That broadcast reminded us all that this is a commercial venture, didn't it?
It is, yeah, and the commercial venture provided a lot of great exposure for the state of New Mexico. And while the actual event was focused on Richard Branson and his investment, the day two story was really focused on why New Mexico was selected. And I think that it was a big win for New Mexico because the state is seen as an early adopter, having started investing in this project more than a decade ago. So, there's a lot of definite pros, obviously a lot of money invested by the state, and people are wondering where that return on investment is. Mm-hmm. I think we got a part of that back on July 11, and I think that we're actually going to be seeing more and more in the space tourism. But, Spaceport is really more than Virgin Galactic. There are also a lot of other missions out there, which we can talk about another time. But yeah, so it's a great win for New Mexico.
Mm-hmm. Laura, are you in agreement? Great win for New Mexico?
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of space. I think anybody who watches me on here knows that I'm a big fan of the sci-fi and the Star Trek and the Star Wars. And so for me, this is just amazing. It's so nice to be part of something positive, something, looking into the future. We got a lot of accolades across the country. Well, Branson did, of course, in Virgin Galactic, but all of it with the background of New Mexico, a lot of remotes happening from here, which was nice. And so anything we can do to boost our presence, I think, and our national picture, and people can learn more about it. And of course, all of the stuff that I saw had New Mexico True on the top, left corner. So that's always nice branding. And hopefully people checked out our state website for some tourism.
Mm-hmm. Julianne, pick up on that. I'm glad Laura mentioned the Zia logo. I got to say, of all the feedback I saw on Facebook, that might have been the number one thing for locals here that they were the most proud of, to see that on that spaceship like that. What's the value, all that kind of a thing? Is it just for us? Is it for others? I mean, how do you see the value there?
I think people are definitely excited. We've all, been watching the stars, so to speak, and it's been decades that these projects have been underway with some fits and starts. So I think that's been really exciting for our state. I think, though, in this time, it is really hard for a lot of people to hear the word billionaire and be excited about it, especially when New Mexico remains at the bottom of all the education rankings in the United States. It's hard for some people to stomach the spending on the space race, even though much of it is private. as Dan pointed out, there's also a lot of public investment here. You've got the counties of Doña Ana and Sierra that are repaying, a couple $100 million worth of debt for the spaceport. Just to kind of put that in perspective, that's about the same amount of money that the city and county of Santa Fe spent on the Buckman Direct Diversion Project, which provides water for all the people that live in this region. It's just one of the sources. So while I think it's exciting, I think it's also brought up, a lot of issues about economic conditions and disparity. And again, it's 600 people have bought tickets to use this commercial space travel to ride what's essentially like a carnival ride into space to get a view of the Earth. They're paying more than $200,000 each to do that. And, I think from where many of us sit, that just is hard to understand.
Julie, are you space shaming? Is that what's happening here?
No, my dad's a big space fan. He's already signed up for the sweepstakes and, I hope he gets to go. And I know it's fun for people, but I just want to bring up that, it's not all unicorns and rainbows and mariachis, as we like to say here in New Mexico.
It's a reasonable point. Tom, you can pick up on that as well if you would. For a lot of people, it's a lot of angst here about this. A little bit of a heartburn that, you've got 1,000 people on the ground, making sure this thing operates correctly, and we don't get that kind of attention in lots of other parts of our life. Is it a separate deal to you? Should we just consider these things separately, or how should we mix them if we have to?
Yeah, well, everything has a place, right? And we can definitely focus on, how else could that money have been spent? And then we can look at the other areas where public money is being spent, whether it be, education, whether it be infrastructure. All of those are very important issues, and all of those are being funded to the level that elected officials need it to be funded. But I think that there's a big need, and what we saw here over this last 10 years, not just in spaceport, but a variety of other areas, is a public-private partnership. And those public-private partnerships take place in a variety of different scenarios, whether it's in universities, the national labs. Spaceport is just one small part of that particular area that happened to get a lot of publicity over the last couple of weeks.
Hey, Laura, I got a business question for you here. Virgin Galactic signed a 20-year lease to be the anchor tenant at Spaceport. Tom mentioned there's other things going on there, certainly. But that means probably 6 years of actual business operations doing what they said they're going to do a few years ago. And the idea of a new contract has been just a little not there quite yet. Are we in trouble here in just a couple of years?
I don't know that it's time to panic or think that we're in trouble. I think that it takes a long time to negotiate these kinds of relationships. It took a long time. It was interesting to read some of the coverage and see Governor Bill Richardson commenting on this and talking about how it was vindication to a certain extent of his thoughts back when this was just an idea. That was always very interesting. I was around during that time, as I'm sure many of you were, in those discussions. But it takes a long time to negotiate these kinds of deals. So I'm not sure that we're in a place yet where we need to be concerned. I think that this will be something, hopefully, if it goes well, barring any kind of huge disasters, which is a possibility always. I think that we're in a good place to see more of this to come.
But the price remains an issue. I'll just use you as an example. What's your number to go to space? Is it 50,000, 100,000, 150,000? You personally, what would you pony up to go into space?
Me personally?
Yeah.
I'm really, really happy to be a spectator on this. I don't even ride amusement park rides, to be honest with you. So I'm really interested in sort of watching it unfold, but I'm not interested in doing it myself personally. I'm okay just right above the clouds.
There you go.
Yeah, I think that the $200,000 ticket price is really low end. I mean, because you figure when those tickets went on sale, probably 5 years ago. Now I would imagine that price is going to absolutely, no pun intended, skyrocket because the cost of doing business has just increased exponentially. Competition has increased, which would typically decrease price. But with Jeff Bezos and his launch which will be taken just south of New Mexico, there's $200,000 is is a bargain, I think, as far as what we'll find here in the future.
Interesting point there. Julianne, can we expect that if Branson and Virgin Galactic are making money, that New Mexico is going to make money as well?
I don't know. I was thinking about that in the context of all the different pieces here. And, I'm curious about whether that ticket revenue is, are we getting a GRT on every ticket sold?
Nice.
And how did they set that up? New Mexico has not really locked in this whole buying things on the internet and collecting the tax revenue situation. So I'm curious about that. Although, you may be aware, and readers, watchers may be aware that the GRT system in New Mexico is very private. We're not going to know exactly how much came from which businesses and why. That's just the nature of the laws here about that kind of disclosure.
Yeah.
So you can't, I worked at Tax and Rent for a little while, so you can't know specifically which taxpayers are paying what. But when you see an increase from a certain sector in, let's say, Doña Ana County and Sierra County, over time, you will probably be able to see some trends that will indicate that there is a GRT coming in. And I'll tell you that, I would be very surprised if there was any, and we could probably look this up, if there was any kind of GRT exemption for this. Pretty much if you're providing a service in the state of New Mexico, you're paying your GRT. And if you're not paying it, they'll get you eventually. So I do think that there will be some GRT revenue coming from this over time.
Interesting point there. Hey, Tom, just a couple of minutes left here, but I got to get this in. The tourism department, interestingly, is closely tracking the development of the travel market to and from spaceports. That's interesting, Essentially, the spaceport becomes another airport. So the tourism department thinks that might eventually be a larger pool of money than those looking for an up and back trip from the spaceport. Does anyone have a sense of what that market would be, Tom? Is that a viable angle here?
I think it's an angle. Whether it's a viable angle, I think only time will tell. The Department of Tourism is very much invested in this. They did pay $1.5 million for the Presented by New Mexico True.
That's right.
That appeared on all the Virgin Galactic videos. So they're wanting to see success. I think that potentially tracking the spaceport as in the same way that they track Santa Fe Airport, the Sunport. We will have to see if there's a lot of revenue to be generated from that. But I think that the bigger story is that you have the spaceport is to economic development what Balloon Fiesta is to tourism. And so I think that the spaceport angle is really more of an economic development pitch as far as why businesses are being based down in Southeast New Mexico, Albuquerque's emerging presence in the aerospace industry. So that's really I think the big takeaway from the successful launch and landing.
Laura, just last word on this. Tom got us going on this space tourism. You think about 17 years ago when people started throwing in that term around, people were like, what? This is not even possible. Now that we've gotten off the ground, so to speak, are you more optimistic about the future for New Mexico and space tourism or about the same? What's your sense of it?
No, I am more optimistic, certainly. I think this was a huge stake in the ground, so to speak, on getting that entire industry off the ground. Intended, although it's pun day apparently for all of us. But I do think that it makes a huge difference. And for those communities that don't see a lot of traffic, like we do here in Albuquerque and Santa Fe, those are established tourist kind of destinations across the country. But in areas like, Sierra County, Truth or Consequences, some of the hot springs down there, which are great if you ever have a chance to go down there, Las Cruces and some of its outdoor recreation, I think it's going to be huge for those areas. And if they can bundle up some of those activities for folks as they come through New Mexico, it's going to be really huge for those counties.
Good last point there. We'll have to set the spaceport aside for the time being. This group is back talking politics in just a few minutes.
I was really just looking for unaccounted for students on the reservation. I wanted to know what that looked like, and more importantly, what those unaccounted for students were doing. Where were they and what were they doing? And to kind of occupy their time if they were either not in school anymore or they just kind of dropped off, why they dropped off.
UNM is ready to bring back the pack this fall with full in-person learning. The university has flirted with the idea of requiring vaccinations of all students, staff, and faculty. But in the end, and after getting plenty of public input, they backed off that idea. But as I found out this week in a special Facebook Live, The goal is still to get to a 100% vaccination rate. And UNM's Chief Marketing and Communications Officer, Cinnamon Blair, has some ideas on how to get there. Also joining me was Gabe Sanchez of UNM's Center for Social Policy to provide important research on why some people are still hesitant to get vaccinated.
Right now, we're following any of the state guidance, and we are referring to CDC. But if mask wearing for those who aren't vaccinated is also part of our policy on campus.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, what we want to do is get everybody vaccinated. This is a really big push. The president sent out a message on Monday and set this aspirational goal for 100% vaccination. Our Health Sciences Center had done a 10 to 100 challenge. They're at 93% vaccinated right now. But to keep us safe and also to just really create this culture of efficacy in protecting ourselves and the PAC and our community as we move forward from COVID, from flu, not coming to work sick, really being mindful of our health and the health of our community and the impact that it has. That's the long-term goal. The short-term goal is to get people to be vaccinated. We'll be offering some incentive drives. We'll be promoting this heavily in the upcoming weeks before our students return to campus.
That is a perfect lead-in to Gabe Sanchez from the UNM Center for Social Policy and the study you folks have taken on to find out why, in fact, Gabe, folks are not willing to get vaccinated, sometimes after the first vaccination, sometimes zero. Let's talk about the study. This is very interesting. I didn't realize how large it was. Tell us about the goal, what you wanted to get across with this study.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Gene. Great to see you. I think the overall study was massive, over 20,000 respondents across the country. And we had a New Mexico oversample. I think 2,050 some odd New Mexicans participated in our study. And it was really focused exactly as you noted, identifying, at that point, how many folks have been vaccinated, what are some of the obstacles or barriers to vaccination, particularly for diverse communities, and what messages could be paired with messengers to try to increase uptake. And fortunately, we had a sample specific to New Mexico of young adults that included college students. So hopefully we're thinking our data could help inform the efforts of UNM and other higher ed institutions in the state.
Was there any one solid thread of thought that you folks uncovered in this study that said this is why folks are refusing to get vaccinated?
Well, I'll talk specifically about the young adults, and that for us and our survey is 18 to 29-year-olds. And it was a mixture of both just lack of basic information. Young adults in our survey sample were much more likely than the older segments to identify that they really didn't know all the details on how to go about getting vaccinated. Right. And unfortunately, a high percentage of those folks indicated that one of the barriers for them was cost and that they might be unemployed. And we know here in New Mexico, that doesn't matter, right? So it's an indicator to us that just basic information, that it's free and open to everybody, could really help, particularly those young adults and college students to get vaccinated. Sure. And one of the best outcomes from our survey is we tested a number of different incentives and posed those at very low amounts, $25 all the way to $500. And fortunately, I think for the university, young adults and college students were more likely than the older segments of the population to say yes. Even a small incentive, as small as $25 to $100, significantly increases their likelihood of getting vaccinated.
Let's peel back to something you mentioned earlier that is very important. That is how these things are seen inside various disparate communities. Let's take the African American community first. And there was a focus there in the study, but very interesting to kind of see this as well, that, it's very well documented, the hesitancy in the African American community for these things. What was your research telling you in that regard?
What really stood out for us when we think about the Black population was the Johnson & Johnson, a particular brand of vaccination. And our colleagues at the AARC pointed out early on that part of this is ongoing challenges with Johnson & Johnson as it relates to talcum powder and other things that disproportionately impact the African American community. So there was already a lack of trust, if you will, among that particular brand. And that obviously is filtering over into thinking about the vaccines. And another piece of the puzzle is we asked about discrimination experiences that all survey respondents across racial groups have had, particularly with the medical industry or the healthcare systems. Mm-hmm. And both the African American and Native American community were much more likely than other racial and ethnic groups to say that they've experienced unfair treatment within the healthcare system. And that definitely has implications for just trust in the vaccine.
Do some of the same things you just mentioned apply to Native American population as well on that hesitancy part?
Yeah, absolutely. Some upside is Native Americans here in New Mexico have been among the leaders in terms of early vaccination. And I think that's a direct credit to everything our tribes and pueblos have been doing to try to make vaccinations as readily available to the community as possible. So that's the upside. The downside is once you look at folks who have not been vaccinated yet, Native Americans have some of the highest levels of hesitancy. And again, lack of trust from both the federal government, state government, healthcare industry is a major factor for Native Americans, and for good reason. But another interesting trend that I was looking at actually early this morning within our data is that for Native Americans, particularly those who have underlying conditions or who are obese or perceive that they are, there's a large hesitancy to get the vaccination because they're hearing, and this was widespread from national health experts, that folks who do have things like diabetes or who have been told that they're obese are going to have a greater likelihood of having complications if there are any from the vaccine. So some of this is, again, the underlying inequalities that face a lot of our communities as it relates to healthcare and access to healthcare are definitely feeding into some, let's be honest, some good reservations.
The Hispanic communities particularly, any hesitation there that's particular to this population?
Yeah, one of the things that's not unique to Hispanics, but sticks out in the data, and is consistent with what I've been hearing from nonprofits on the ground, is that there's a significant concern, particularly in this economic climate, where a lot of folks have lost jobs or just starting back to finding a job. There's a lot of concern that if I get the vaccine, I'm hearing from folks, I might be out of work for as much as a week, right? Because of side effects associated with the vaccine. And that's particularly high among our Hispanic population. And it's another one that's logical. Right? If I'm just getting back on my feet, I'm starting to generate, some revenue with the new job, and I'm concerned that if I have to ask for time off, am I going to be able to keep that job? So again, I think a lot of what we found in the survey actually is pretty rational in the context of some of the decisions that folks are having to make when they think about, particularly getting the second dose.
We are still a long way from the Republican gubernatorial primary next year, and it is still anyone's race, but a relatively big name entered the contest last week. TRC Representative Rebecca Dow says she's in. And Laura, this was rumored and even expected in most circles. Now, how does it change the Republican contest, though, and potentially the general election for governor? What do you see here from her announcement?
Well, it's certainly interesting. I mean, we're seeing another female from southern New Mexico jump in. And it reminds me of Susana Martinez jumping in, although at this point, Rebecca Dow probably has a bigger profile than Susana Martinez had back then, which is very interesting to me. There's the potential to definitely get more support behind her. And I think trying to solidify some of those pockets of support around, well, not really pockets, it's largely solid in southern New Mexico. So the other folks that are in now, there's, of course, I'm going to forget his name, Commissioner Block from...
Jay Block from Sandoval County.
Yeah. I was going to say Jerome, but I knew that wasn't right.
That's all right.
Commissioner Jay Block from Sandoval County. I mean, he's going to have some very strong connections in the metro area. But of course, you have to have that statewide connection. I'm not sure he's very well known in southern New Mexico, but he has the potential to raise a lot of money, as does Rebecca Dow. Rebecca Dow, I think, has a very strong backing from a lot of folks in the oil and gas sector, others down in southern New Mexico. So I think this really makes it an interesting primary. And it, of course, will be interesting if she ends up being the nominee, and then you have two women vying for the gubernatorial race. That could be an interesting dynamic.
Not bad there. Hey, Tom, you get the sense that Ms. Dow is the front runner? Some politicos think she is. I'm not talking about Laura, what she just said now, but there was almost an instant, whoa, she's right at the front of the line, when she announced. Is that your sense as well?
Yeah, I believe that she definitely is a front runner right now. What I'm kind of looking at is, what are the key messages that we'll be hearing throughout this campaign, which is, small business recovery, education, infrastructure, and then which candidate is really kind of playing into that particular realm. And the candidates who have declared so far, I think Rebecca Dow definitely checks more of those boxes than some of the other candidates. Not saying that the other candidates don't. I just think she does a better job of it. I also liked what Laura had, that comparison to Susana Martinez. I didn't really make that bridge. So, I think that's a potential, but I think it reinforces what her place is in this campaign right now, which is the temporary front runner. But we have to keep in mind that, the official filing date isn't until February. And so there are many months still ahead before all this stuff settles down.
Good points
We'll
there.
start collecting signatures on October 1st. So that's a lot sooner.
Hey, Julianne, you're in a deep blue city, of course, not a deep red one. Now, from a campaigning standpoint for statewide races, is there anything you've seen successful Republican candidates do to peel off critical Democratic votes in your area? Is there a secret there for Santa Fe and Santa Fe County?
Well, certainly there are a lot of conservative Democrats and unaffiliated voters in the North, not just in the city, but, further north, especially where you have that sort of entrenched, people who are Democrats, but who align with the Republicans on some issues that become prominent in these types of elections. As I was making notes for the show this morning, I was thinking about how many months we have ahead of us of watching these GOP candidates on television with guns in their hands and babies in their arms, not at the same time, hopefully, but we're going to see both of that because of the, reproductive freedom issue and because of the Second Amendment issue that the GOP just, really latches onto for its core messaging. We've seen that recently, and I think we'll see that more. I agree that it's really interesting to have all these candidates. In 2010, when Susana Martinez emerged and went on to, beat Diane Dinish in the general election, there were 5 GOP candidates that year. And then you might remember, too, that in 2014, when she's running for re-election, there's 5 Democrats who are trying to fight it out in the primary. So while it seems like a lot of names and a lot of heads in the race right now, it's not unusual for New Mexico gubernatorial politics. And I think it's a bit of a wild card right now at this stage.
I so appreciate that perspective, that history, as they say, echoes. It doesn't repeat, it echoes. Just for a point of interest, Jay Block was mentioned from Sandoval County. Karen Bodoni, Navajo CD3 candidate. She's in. Tim Walsh, you guys know him. He's a retired educator and also Gary Johnson's advisor back then. And Greg Zanetti, who came out first, as we all know and announced, he's a veteran and a financial advisor, so the field is sort of in there. But I do have a question. Laura, let me start with you on this. I'd like to get a take from Tom as well. In fairness, we have to ask this. How vulnerable is Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham right now? Is the angst about how she managed the pandemic going to be impactful so many months in the future? Laura, what's your feeling on that one?
Well, I certainly think that that's going to be an issue for her. I think that she will have to have a strategy that addresses that, but focuses on the successes. The bottom line is, yes, a lot of people have had a lot of heartburn over the policies that she had, the closures, especially the impact to certain communities and just the business loss. There's businesses that still haven't reopened. But on the other hand, we also have seen a lot lower rates of COVID deaths than other states. And we still, we have a huge vaccination rate here in New Mexico, which is not the case in some of our neighboring states. So she has some successes to show for that as well. So I think that a well-crafted strategy to discuss that is going to be necessary. I think they're going to try to put her on the defensive, and she's just going to have to stay positive about all of her accomplishments and what that means for New Mexico long term. So I think that she will have to address it, but I wouldn't call it a vulnerability. I think the registration and the turnout still is what it is. It's still largely Democrat. Independents tend to vote Democrat, or have in recent years. And so it just really depends who emerges from that Republican primary, and then how they sort of square off for the general.
Important point there. Tom, still in that question, but when I think about it, if I'm Rebecca Dow, that's where I'm going first. I'm taking all the angst from the southern part of the state, from the business community, and that's how I'm launching. I'm going to circle Albuquerque, I'm going to circle Santa Fe, you know what I mean, and kind of build the anger movement, so to speak, and kind of keep that going. But is that viable? Can that really hold up all these months until Election Day comes?
Well, there's the primary strategy, and then there's the general election strategy.
Excellent point.
Primary strategy, like for Greg Zanetti right now, he's focusing on military messaging. That will work real well in Republican circles and getting him a nomination if that's what the party decides. But on the larger scale, there's just not that much capacity. So you need a diversification of message. The vulnerabilities that the governor faces, includes cabinet turnover. Also includes, handling of the pandemic, but at the same, that those issues can also be flipped to a positive, to those who are supporters of the governor, in that, there are some who believe that just as much that it impacted negatively small business, with only 60% small businesses making it through the pandemic period. So you can very easily point to the number of New Mexico lives that were saved and the overall response that really made New Mexico healthier. So, there's, to every con, there's a pro. And, so pros and cons are going to come into play. It just depends what your perspective is of the current governor.
Let me start with Julianne here and take a swipe at the time we have left. Talk about what the big issues will be. Let's set aside the pandemic. Let's talk about the general election, what the issues will or maybe should be in your view.
I think there's one other thing to think about when you're talking about what the governor might brag on or what she may be vulnerable about, and that has to do with the legalization of cannabis. Cannabis sales are going to start in the spring of 22, a few months before this election takes place, and I think that there are a number of independent voters that supported that legalization effort, and I think that there are also going to be people on the attack who are kind of more crime and punishment types. So I think, we're going to see that kind of come up again. Speaking of crime and punishment, I think policing is a big issue that, the governor, frankly, has not addressed in a meaningful way during her time. And I think that the GOP candidates are going to have an even more, a different perspective about that than I think some of what the progressive voters want to talk about. And there's not a great degree of accountability for police in our state when they kill people. Their discipline records are not public, and there's a number of issues. So I'm hoping that issue, there's a little bit of pressure on that front. I certainly think we're going to be talking about education again, as I brought up earlier. We've got the Yazzie Martinez case ruling where the state is really under order to increase equity in education. And I think that's going to come up quite a bit. Issues about childcare and support for insurance systems and healthcare overhaul. I think, remember that Governor Lujan Grisham has a big background in health and in human services. And I think that is also likely to come up, quite a bit during the election.
We'll see, as they say. We'll have plenty more time to talk about the race, but we'll have to stop for now. Now, this group is back for one final topic. What happens when tough on crime policies run up against the realities of the criminal justice system? This being New Mexico, most of us have had the experience with dead zones for cell or internet service. And for most of us, it's just usually a hassle. But as part of Searchlight New Mexico's Hitting Home series about the local impact of COVID-19, a Navajo journalist went home to find out how those hassles turn into major hurdles when it comes to going to school. The article is a terrific read. We'll link to it online. And in the meantime, here's senior producer Matt Grubbs with more.
Sunny Klotchis-Chiligi, thank you so much for joining us and for talking about your work at Searchlight. This was a pretty amazing piece. Talk to me about what you were after when you set out to write it.
I think that, it wasn't necessarily something I would call a new story. I know that it's been touched upon by many outlets but really I think it's just the fact that it was just that touched upon. We had learned throughout the pandemic year, that students were facing a lot of struggles, including internet access, internet connectivity, cellular connectivity, lack of technology, all of those kinds of things. And so, but I wanted to give people a glimpse of, what exactly does that look like for someone on the Navajo Nation with very little or none internet access, and then but also the other challenges of being a K through 12 student on the reservation during the time of the pandemic.
Of course. And the student you keyed in on to start the story, Evan Allen, how did you come across Evan's story, and what did you do to sort of find out what his educational experiences were like through the past year?
I think a big part of it started with a lot of the talk that was happening about unaccounted for kids or students in New Mexico. There was a lot of that talk happening within local media outlets, but also just, obviously among schools, especially since that was a very difficult part for people during the pandemic, was how to handle schools and get students the education they need and deserve. And so I was really just looking for unaccounted for students on the reservation. I wanted to know what that looked like, and more importantly, what those unaccounted for students were doing. Where were they and what were they doing? And to kind of occupy their time if they were either not in school anymore or they just kind of dropped off, why they dropped off. So I think that that's really been the foundation for the interest in this story. And for Evan, I think that it worked out in the sense that, I'm from the T-SNOS Plus community as well, which you all learn a little bit about in the story. And it just so happened that he went to school in New Mexico, lived in T-SNOS Plus in Arizona at the time, which actually was really nice because it presented another issue that people often forget about, that it's a very normal thing for students to go to school in another state and live in another state at that level. And so I think that was kind of surprising for some people, but yes, it was just a blessing to be able to find him, because it's, these students are really hard to find, and to be able to have him share his story. I mean, I often say that he's very brave, because it does take a lot to allow yourself to open up and share your experiences.
Especially at that age, he talked about being physically, mentally, emotionally exhausted. I think you have that great quote from him in the story, and it took a toll on his family too.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, his mother, it was interesting because, kids are kids, and a lot of time they don't share their feelings, especially at that age. They're going through things, they're growing up, and they definitely don't want to share a whole lot with parental figures. But, he was kind of the same. Like he wasn't sharing the troubles that he was having with internet connectivity. And so what's not in the story is his mom tells me about how she thought he was just going to the Hill to, kind of mess around. Like she didn't know that he was going because he was trying to get things done with school. And at one point, she finally realized what he was trying to do. And even she felt guilty because she wasn't aware of his circumstances because he hadn't shared a whole lot. She was under the impression, since she didn't hear from him, that, oh, it's fine, but yeah, it definitely took a toll, because I'd sat with her in the kitchen a number of times talking about, how did it make her feel to sit and watch him go through what he was going through every day. And, she talked about how it just was so frustrating and it felt so helpless because there was not a lot that she could do. She tried calling the school. She tried getting these resources. She dug deep to get him his own hotspot, things like that. So it definitely took a toll on all of them.
The amount of detail and the fact that you were up there more than once certainly comes through in the piece. The idea that this high school kid, had to drive to the top of the hill to get enough cell service to enable him to have a Wi-Fi or a hotspot, a cell hotspot. I mean, and then sit there for sometimes 10 hours to go through school. Sounds like band practice too, maybe, and then to do homework. That's just astounding to me.
It is. I mean, and I really don't think that we will know what it's really like unless we were to do it ourselves. I mean, it was one thing for him to kind of run through it with me and explain it to me and tell me, what he was going through. But it's another to be that person in that position, because every day wasn't the same, because the weather changes, as was mentioned in the story, circumstances change. You might have technology troubles, you might have animals running around your vehicle. I mean, it's pure desert there, high desert. So there's a lot of things that could happen. And so it was more than just him going to school and doing the things that you would do in school. It was all the other things that you have to do to make sure that you stay in school, if that makes any sense. And so there was just so many more factors. It wasn't just about, okay, I need to do my homework, I need to do my schoolwork. It was worrying about things that we often worry about as adults, or that we kind of take for granted, the everyday accessibility things. I think one thing mentioned in the story is that, his mother felt really heartsick about the fact that other students had a lot of conveniences, and that could be something as simple as being in a house doing your homework. That's a convenience that he did not necessarily have. And so, can you imagine playing your instrument in the back of a truck while it's snowing outside, or it's raining, or, whatever it is that the case is. So, it's every aspect of what he's gone throughout the school year working and doing homework from where he was at is just incredible. Nothing short of incredible.
Sure. It's hard not to get choked up thinking about everything that he went through. One of the things that I really liked about the story was it, of course, wasn't just Evan. You point out that it's an underestimate likely, but more than 23,000 Native students are without reliable internet or cellular hotspot access. I can't imagine what that does to the educational experience. What did you find out?
Well, it was really disheartening because I wanted to understand what that was like for students who perhaps just dropped out or, that were unaccounted for. And that's honestly how this story started. It was, I think that not long ago, the state or local outlets were talking about these unaccounted for children or students. And I wanted to know what that looked like on the Navajo Nation. And the bigger question was, where are they and what are they doing? And so, what I found was through Evan, which is he's quoted in the story saying that he knew of classmates who just simply stopped coming to class. He knew of some that when this fall semester came, they just decided not to sign up. He knew of some that just stay home and watch TV, and then we have people who are on the administrative end of the education systems who are well aware of these circumstances, are well aware that students just can't do it. I mean, I had one source tell me that parents were just so frustrated that they were also up in arms and sometimes would just say, okay, well, I'm just going to take my kid out because this is too much. I can't do this. So there's still not a definite of where exactly these students went and what they were doing. But I can tell you that from the other family mentioned in the story, the Marianos, they talked about how, which wasn't in the story, but how when their kids weren't given the technology, that they just had their kids do housework or work on projects until they got that. And so I kind of imagine that that's what some of those kids were doing who were at home. But I'm pretty certain that a lot of them were not being very productive and were just kind of, doing things that they would typically do on a weekend or something from school.
And it strikes me that the difference between, say you're in a home that has reliable high-speed internet, you can learn quite effectively for 40 minutes. And I have no doubt that there are other students out there and other families who are also doing projects around the house and things like that you just kind of normally do during the day if you're at home. But the difference, if you don't have any access versus that high-speed access is monumental. How does it fall into the framework of the Yazzie Martinez decision, which I know sort of rides above so much of education in New Mexico?
I mean, I think that, going to school on the reservation is a very tough thing in itself, whether or not we have these technology issues or lack of broadband or, things like that. The circumstances are even deeper than that. I mean, in the story, it talks about lack of electricity. I mean, we're talking about how infrastructure also affects this or the lack thereof. And so I think that's a big part of I guess that's a big part of what makes that unique and kind of what makes going to school on the reservation unique or being a student who lives on the reservation and goes to school off of it. I mean, I think I learned a lot of that just focusing on, in the story I mentioned, Central Consolidated School District. It's one of the few, I think perhaps one of the few schools that operates very uniquely in the sense that it is not fully on the reservation. Some schools are on, some schools are off. And so there's a lot of I guess, guidance that they have to get, not just from the state, but also from the tribe, but also from the parents themselves. And so it can be really tricky at times. And I think that the Yazzie Martinez kind of, it gets things started into looking at what are some of these things that affects the overall education of Navajo students. But then when you look deeper and a little bit beyond education at the deeper problems that exist, you see kind of world problems, if you will, nation problems within the Navajo Nation that we're obviously constantly hearing about through every story that comes out of the Navajo Nation more recently within the last year is infrastructure. And so I think that Yazzie Martinez is great in the sense that it presents some of these problems that have been long overlooked.
Did anyone you spoke with at the district level or the school level say, well, it's been rough, but but now that we have Yazzie Martinez, things are better, or is it just not there yet?
No, I think that it's going to be a lot of work. I mean, take for example, something that's a little bit of an aside, impact aid. Impact aid is something that a lot of people don't know about, but it's federal aid that a lot of these schools get that have a Native population. And for years and years, a lot of these schools, which have a high Native population, were missing out on some of this money that was being taken out by the state. And so a lot of them spoke about that rather, because they all felt that it would have really made a difference had they had that money they had gotten from impact aid. So I honestly didn't have someone really talk to me about Yazzie Martinez. I brought that into the story on my own while looking for numbers. But I think that is where that case definitely helped, was giving us a sense of how big is this problem that we're mentioning in this story. And that is, helping us see what is happening with students on the reservation.
Certainly. And if I have it right, impact aid, for folks who don't know, is a federal program that's designed to replace what districts would get in property tax income or funding. Because, for example, where there's a lot of federal land or tribal land, they're not getting taxes from that, but the state was actually counting it towards what they should have gotten already, and all that's changing. But I can't imagine what a difference it would have made if these districts would have had 10, 15, 20 years of that money being in their classrooms.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I had the Mr. Montoya, who's mentioned from the CC, Central Consolidated School District board president, mentioned to me, and he spent I'm very thankful to him for explaining to me what all of that was, because it can be very complicated. But, he had mentioned, I asked him just flat out, how much of a difference do you think that would have made had you had that? Could it have really offset what you're talking about in terms of lack of funding? And he said, oh, absolutely. We would have had just probably everything that we needed for every student that we had. And so I think that definitely shows the big impact that it could have made.
Well, Sunny, it's a great read, and we'll make sure to post a link to it. But thanks so much for all your time.
Thank you for having me.
Republican and Democratic lawmakers often like to take and cultivate a tough-on-crime image. That's certainly true in the legislature, and almost a guarantee when it comes to candidates for district attorney. But there's another side to that policy. A recent Albuquerque Journal article highlighted the 12th Judicial District, where public defenders say they're buried by nearly 300 felony cases that are scheduled for a 4-week period starting later this month. Now, the DA down there, that's Alamogordo and Ruidoso, by the way, says his prosecutors have to prepare for those cases too. And the chief judge says most of those trials won't actually take place. But Laura, you're kind of a natural place to start here. Do the public defenders have a point about being able to prepare an effective defense? Let's just start with the real basics of law here.
Oh, absolutely. I think they have a very valid point. We're talking about something like 24 trials or 24 different hearings in a day.
Right.
So it's unclear which ones of those would actually be dismissed or postponed and which ones would move forward with trial. There's just no way to sort of know that from a preparation standpoint. So one of the points they bring up is they have to be prepared for every trial,
right,
which makes it very, very difficult to provide an adequate defense. Now, on the flip side, the prosecutor is also in a similar situation, right? Mm-hmm. And that's a lot of coordinating potential witnesses, talking about, law enforcement, other eyewitnesses, whoever is part of the docket. You're really, I think somebody said this, it was a circus-like atmosphere.
Right.
I can imagine that, because you just don't have that level of resources. And these are areas, I've actually had cases down there before, not in criminal, but in civil case when I was in private practice. Mm-hmm. And, they're very small courtrooms. Everybody pretty much knows everybody in terms of the staff. And it's going to be very difficult for them to be able to do this adequately. So I think it is a crisis-like situation, and not a unique one to the 12th Circuit, which is Alamogordo, Ruidoso, you mentioned, mm-hmm. But could also occur in a lot of other areas around the state.
Mm-hmm. Julianne, Laura just mentioned the nightmare scenario. We got reporting that people are waiting in their cars each day to find out if they'll be needed to be a juror or a witness. That's not tenable. And certainly it's not ideal, but does it seem like prosecutors are overcharging? Is that part of the problem here?
I mean, that's certainly a point that, Bennett Bauer, the chief public defender, raised with respect to this 12th judicial district. Again, this is in that, crime and punishment part of the state in, southern New Mexico and Otero and Lincoln counties. And I think that, that argument, without really looking at the data and the kind of cases that are being presented, it's really hard to make it an outside judgment of that. But definitely in that journal story, the prosecutor there, the district attorney, is not an apologist for that. He says, like, this is what people want. They want me to throw the book at these, suspected alleged criminals, and they don't want me to make plea deals. I think it's interesting. This is not universally the way that district attorneys feel. Santa Fe elected Mary Carmack Outwise here. Again, the data is kind of not there yet because it's new. But our district attorney up here, Rio Arriba Los Alamos in Santa Fe County, has said, let's keep people out of the court system. Let's divert people who are facing, small charges that are related to drugs and behavioral health. And I think that her perspective about that is really gonna, we'll see if that changes things. That's quite different from what the guy in the 12th is saying.
Isn't that interesting? That distinction. Go ahead, Laura.
I mean, that's not really surprising. You get elected from a certain area. Santa Fe is what it is. That entire area is pretty liberal. I'm not saying that in a bad way, but they're progressives, right? They're going to be very different on crime than some of these rural areas. And so the district attorneys, unfortunately, because of the type of system that we have where they get elected, they're going to reflect what their electors are wanting from them, or else they're not going to be elected again. Right. You have people that are tough on crime on the one hand, on the other hand are messaging the way Santa Fe is. Here in Albuquerque, we see sort of a hybrid of the two, but ultimately people here want to see tough on crime also, right? More so probably than Santa Fe. So I think this kind of reflects the diversity of our state. And it's very difficult for some of these prosecutors to see where that fine line is, right? Where you need to do your job, but you also need to make sure that you're reflecting whatever your electors want from you.
Interesting points there. Tom, the DA previously mentioned Scott Key, unapologetically said nobody pleads guilty to something they didn't do, which is kind of ridiculous because that's just wrong. We've seen that time and again for all kinds of reasons. In this situation, that caseload means there's a natural tendency to consider what Julie mentioned earlier, a plea deal. Doesn't it? I mean, do all roads not lead to more plea deals here?
Oh yeah, most definitely. Yeah, the numbers are just staggering, and it's great to see Ali Uderbrook with the Albuquerque Journal getting some of this in-depth type of coverage and stuff. But 276 felony jury trials in a 4-week period. That's just mind-boggling. And so what that tells me is that there are a lot of plea deals, and I think Matt Chavez, when he said that do innocent people get convicted? Absolutely. And so, that's really concerning because, you have folks who are, were arrested for a reason or cited for a reason, but they don't necessarily have a chance to really defend themselves the way that they want to in court. And so as a result, you have folks who will plea bargain out for a lesser sentence just to get on with their life. And that, I think, is not a good reflection of the justice system at all.
Yeah, no doubt.
I think it's really important to note, too, that the root of this is about fully funding the judiciary.
Thank you.
The speedy trials are a real thing that people are, allowed to expect under the Constitution. And when you are trying to cram the public defender's office into adequately defending, you're trying to, cram all this stuff in, and there's not enough money. That's really the problem here. And that is something that our government can act on.
Laura, let me follow up on that. That's a very good point. I know you know this, but for the folks watching, if you haven't seen felony arraignments, especially here in Albuquerque or at a busier court, it's really quite something. I mean, the word circus came up with attorneys on both sides wheeling stacks and boxes of case files in and out. Sometimes they've only given the briefest look to those things. Are we pushing too much to the court, Laura? Should we just expect that, this is the natural result of pushing all this to the courtroom?
Well, there's a lot of problems with our system, I think, and the backlog in the courts is one of them. There's just an inadequacy of resources across the board. And so you have, from the officers and the arresting, agencies, to processing at the jails, to the actual court staff, the judges. Everybody is overwhelmed, and the public defenders in particular are also extremely understaffed. Very difficult to keep people employed in those positions too, because there's such high burnout because of this kind of process. So you end up having folks who are in those jobs that are not staying for very long. They develop an expertise, they go out and they see greener pastures elsewhere. So it is a very, very huge problem, and one that I think Julie brings up an important point. We could address this, and there should be more attention paid to funding the judiciary adequately, as well as other law enforcement agencies.
Hey, Tom, quick question. Do policymakers really need to rethink what it means to be tough on crime? Is that what's going on here as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think we have to redefine what that soundbite really means. Is it? So yeah, I think that there's always an opportunity to kind of, not just use that soundbite, but say, okay, what exactly does that mean?
Right.
Does that mean more arrests? Does it mean more convictions? Does it mean, And to Julianne's point, it's really, properly funding the judiciary has been something that has been an issue for the last, 10 years. And stuff. So, that I think is one of the roots of the issues. The other is that, you have, varied elected officials, different parts of the state who all have a different, watermark about what that means being tough on crime.
Julianne, last word. I got a minute on this, on tough on crime. Same question. Something just has gone off the rails here with this idea?
Certainly. I mean, I think I mentioned before that I feel like this is a buzzword that's used by a certain segment of voters. It's certainly coded language. We know that our criminal justice system has been unfairly implemented on, name the group. I think that we have a lot of work to do on that front, and the definition of tough on crime doesn't really further the conversation. So I'm curious to see, what will unfold in New Mexico as we explore different ways to deal with this. I think all of these ideas are antiquated, and we don't do ourselves a service by just, sticking with the existing paradigm.
Sure. Good last word there. Hey, thanks to all of our panelists for their research and thoughts this week. Remember, you can always let us know what you'd like to see on the show by catching up with us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. We're out of time. Thanks again for joining us and for staying informed and engaged. We'll see you again next week in Focus.
Funding for New Mexico in Focus provided by the McCune Charitable Foundation and viewers like you.